Hello, Tennessee Voices viewers and listeners. This is David Plazas, the Opinion and Engagement Director for the USA Today Network Tennessee and the Tennessean. Today, I have the pleasure of having as my guest Sara Figal, who is the Executive Director of the Nashville Conflict Resolution Center. Sara, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm great. Thanks. Glad to be here.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. And for those who are unfamiliar with the center, would you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah. The Nashville Conflict Resolution Center is probably Middle Tennessee's best kept secret. We are what's called a community mediation center, meaning we are a nonprofit organization that provides free dispute resolution services for people who usually can't afford a lawyer, right? And who have gotten engaged in some kind of a conflict that requires or that has landed them maybe in court or in some kind of an issue with the police. And what we do is provide what's called in the legal system alternative dispute resolution. We can grab people before they have to go to court and see if we can't in a private and confidential setting work out something for them. Well, help them work out something in their own in their own language on their own terms that will help them avoid any other ramifications. And we do this, we've been doing it in Davidson County for 22 years. And this last year, as I've been doing my end of year reporting, I realized almost 30% of our cases are now coming from surrounding counties too, because we can provide online services.
This matter of dispute resolution, could you talk about the scope of it? Because I know that we've had the opportunity to talk
Yeah.
about the issue related to evictions and housing and those kinds of things, but what else comes into the scope of your center's practice?
I mean, in truth, we can help with any kind of conflict that arises. Our the primary arenas that we work are, as you said, in like general sessions, civil court for people who have landlord-tenant issues or debt or small business conflicts, maybe employee-employer conflicts, but also neighbor disputes. Um, then we also are in kind of the parenting arena. There are a lot of people who, share custody of children, and they may not even be technically biological parents. They could be custodians, guardians, and it can be really tough to share the raising of children. Um, Judges are willing to give people parenting plans, but if people can design their own, they tend to be much more successful and there's a lot less stress in the home. So we provide that service that the court is very happy that we do. Um, and then we do something that's called victim offender mediation. So if adults or youth are involved in something that, like assault or harassment, something that would probably be criminal if it had to go all the way up into the court system, and if it's low key enough, DAs are willing to say, why don't you see if things can be resolved in a different way without needing to come through the court system? And then we also will provide mediation, and I should say all this is free of charge for the most part. We may need to change that a little bit given our current financial realities. But for the most part, I mean, we've been delivering free mediation for years, and we'll never, ever not mediate because someone can't afford it. I mean, we exist to make sure that everyone has access to this alternative in the legal system. It's very inclusive. But I was going to say, we also we do have agreements with both our Community Oversight Board here in Davidson County and the Metro Police Department's Office of Professional Accountability. So for cases when citizens have registered a complaint against an officer, feeling just poorly treated, for example, we will often provide mediation to see if there isn't a way to open communication between the people involved. And that's incredibly rewarding.
One thing I'd love to talk to you about, especially since we live in this era of polarization and a lot of anger and so forth,
Yeah.
how do you do a successful mediation? What does that mean to be successful?
The luxury of being a nonprofit mediation center is that we don't work for the courts. And so we really do. We can look hard at precisely the question you ask. What makes a good mediation? And it's not just that we've checked a settlement box, right? What I believe is the sign of a good mediation is that people who walked into a room thinking the other person was the embodiment of a problem leave the room having heard each other as human beings with some degree of empathy. And it may be that we have together found ways to resolve everything that was on the table. And it may be that they came up with ways to resolve some of the stuff. And it may be that they look at each other at the end and say, can't agree. And then we just say, fine, no harm, no foul. That just means mediation was not the right tool for the problem, but they no longer feel enmity and stress and frustration because they know they've been heard and they know that the other person deserves to be heard. And they then go forward just much more balanced and feeling like part of a community that may have to continue wrestling with an issue, but in a much healthier way.
Yeah, I think a lot of this in terms of the work on civic engagement and civility that I'm involved in, and one of the most difficult things is to address the issue of listening and listening to each other. And what are your tips? If you had kind of a listening 101, what might you tell people? How do they get to a space where they can really be attentive?
Boy, it's it requires real awareness. Real awareness. I was just thinking about a mediation I did recently with young people. Okay, and mediation's confidential, but I can explain the fact pattern. Right, there were two young boys, middle school, and they had been in a fight at the end of the school year at school that was serious enough to land them in the juvenile court. Fortunately, we have people at our courts in Davidson and surrounding counties who understand, especially if these are first-time offenses, that probably just a judge saying, you're terrible, isn't going to be very much help. So I found myself mediating online, and so we're on a Zoom screen. I'm on a Zoom screen. My co-mediator had a Zoom box, and then there were two Zoom boxes, one with this young man and his mom, and the other with the other young man and his mom. And they all came in upset because this had happened a while ago. Both of the mothers were in, kind of mama bear mode, very polite, but very upset with the system, upset things had taken a long time to get to mediation, upset that that their boys were potentially, threatened with juvenile, some kind of a juvenile record they were afraid of. And so to help them hear each other, right, this was my first task, was first to make sure that they felt heard. And when I would invite them to talk, I would listen and just continue to be curious. And I think one of the things in terms of listening that's most important is that we don't listen for confirmation bias. We don't listen for the punchline we're waiting for. We don't set up questions waiting to get what we want to move on. We ask questions and really hear what that question might lead to. Right? Because then asking follow-up questions helps the speaker know that we're paying attention, first of all, right? And that we care enough to want to know more. In a mediation, obviously, I'm not going to ask questions that go way off topic, but in a conflict, I would say, so I'm just really curious. Have you guys ever fought before? No. Huh. So what was different that day, right? Why? What do you suppose happened that day that made you respond in a way you never had before? And they were like, huh, well, and they'd think and they'd talk. And I'd say, well, that's really interesting. So if that happened, was that the first time? Is there a different way you could have responded to that? And it's developing a conversation not along an agenda that I bring, but following kind of the thought patterns and concerns of the people I'm listening to. That helps.
I find that really fascinating. I find that really fascinating because, one of the things I often compare this kind of work to that I'm involved in is it's almost like a sports match or a game, in that there are rules to be followed.
Yeah.
And when people agree to those rules, if you're offsides, then the ref has to say, wait a second, you got to come back in. this isn't right. And I don't know if you find yourself in that predicament in terms of what you do.
Oh, sometimes, sure. There are sometimes that people are so emotionally, they come in so at such a high emotional pitch that they begin over talking each other, and they could maybe, our rules of the road are everyone gets a voice, right? There's no rush, so please, let people have their turn. And we do not allow people to speak derogatorily to or about each other. We just don't. Now, part of my job as a mediator is to help reframe things that are kind of negative, but there have been times when things explode enough and I just say, okay, we're going to have to stop now, because if you can't kind of agree to the rules of the road, because if you don't, then this isn't a mediation, and I only do mediation, right? So either we talk among each other and not insult each other, or we got to stop. And it's always interesting to see and to find ways of bringing people back in or not. I mean, it's tricky though, because you also have to, I always say when I'm training mediators, you have to check your own normal at the door, right? Normal communication patterns for me are my thing, make me comfortable. They have nothing to do with how things should go in a mediation, right? So one of the first things I have to do also is listen for what is normal for the people who've come to the table. And they may share a conflict style that's really loud. Okay, my personal conflict style is not, but if theirs is, then it's fine for them to be loud, And I'm looking for signs to make sure that they're comfortable with the loud, that one person isn't being overwhelmed, that it's not turning toxic. But I have to be careful in figuring out where they may be kind of veering outside of the rules of mediation, that I'm not just imposing my norms on them.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And before we continue in this conversation, I always like to ask my guests midway if they would share a little bit of what they've been doing to cope during this time of COVID. We're in a different spot than we were in 2020 when the show first started. But at the same time, leaders have a terrible time of taking care of themselves as well as they take care of others, in my experience. But I would love to know, what are you reading, watching, doing to stay healthy and well?
Oh, I love reading novels, and I love cooking, and I love eating, and I love playing the harp. And I've been doing so much of all of that the whole time. Actually, I just finished one novel I finished that I loved was Neil Stephenson's Termination Shock. Fantastic. I like really thick novels. If I'm going to go into another world, I just want to linger there and feel what it's like for a long time. And Termination Shock is this fascinating, typical of Neil Stephenson, kind of futuristic, but not too futuristic novel that looks at very interesting possible responses to climate change. That's all I'll say. It's fabulous. Go read it if you haven't yet. And I actually, this week, I'm so thrilled I could just, I had a new beautiful semi-grand concert harp delivered to my house. I've been playing, for the last 3 years, I had more time at home. And music was a way to really just turn off my thinking brain, the thinking brain that's attached to language. There's still a lot of thought in music. And I've been working with a jazz harp teacher who lives in Wales. We work online. And now I'm finally able to work again with an incredible teacher here in town who in person. But that's just been a godsend because again, music it engages emotions. It's a sensory thing, and it's also very mindful, but not rooted in language. So I can shut everything else out.
I feel you as someone who is an amateur guitar player and has learned several chords over the last year and a half or so.
Right?
It's actually a lot of fun. And not knowing that I'm not going to perform on stage with Keith Urban, it makes it much less pressure for me to have to hit the right
Exactly.
note.
Yeah. People say, "Oh, can I hear you?" It's like, no, because the whole point is I just want to get lost in it. I don't want to have, any track of my mind thinking, Do they think I sound good or do they think I'm terrible? I just don't, it's not worth it. The privilege of age now, I claim, is that I don't have to do anything to impress anybody. I just have to do my best at whatever I do.
Oh, no, that's right on. So I hear you. Well, let me ask you a little bit about yourself. If I read correctly, you have a background in theater and in German literature. Is that right?
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that and where that comes from and how you got to where you are today.
Oh, I have, from my perspective now, I would say I have gone through life always being willing to just walk through open doors. I've done almost nothing because I set out to do exactly that. Um, I, you know, went to college thinking I was going to do one thing, ended up moving to Los Angeles and doing theater for a number of years because I had started doing it at school in college, um, and had a wonderful time. And then I realized I was actually really bored, working in theater and film, and ended up going to graduate school, which I have to admit was sort of the family business.
Mhm.
I grew up with academic people for the most part. And so I went and I got a PhD in German literature. And, you know, the, the long version of the story would take a really long time, David. But, that was really because I love thinking about literature. And I picked German literature because I really loved the period of the Enlightenment where, a lot of the issues that we're grappling with today, like what is democracy? What is an individual in relationship to a collective? What should a civil society provide its people? I mean, all of those questions are really first put on the table and rigorously examined in the 18th century in Europe, at least in the European tradition. And I
Mhm.
just loved it. So I did that, and I did that for a good 10 years, which so far has kind of been like, at 10 years, I seem to evolve. Uh, and at a certain point, and there are lots of detours here, but I ended up, I was here in Nashville, and I trained as a volunteer mediator with NCRC because a Vanderbilt colleague of mine, asked me to do it with her for funny reasons. And I did, and I started volunteering, and um, it was so engaging and humbling. And I had thought of myself up to that point. I mean, I'd done enormous amounts of travel, and I'd written a couple books, and I've just done a lot of things, and so I thought of myself as pretty worldly, and all of that was just like squashed flat, and I was humbled. Right when I start mediating with people, um, and just learning about how so many different people live their lives with such dignity and in such interesting ways that I'd never experienced or really come into contact with. So that was just an incredible learning experience for me as a human. So I just got more and more involved until finally, well, here I am. I'm I'm pretty much I'm all in.
No,
It's
no,
just me because mediation is something, as my youngest son said, and he's very engaged in politics these days. He said, mediation is just one of those things that simply should exist, right? It shouldn't need, you shouldn't have to worry about funding it one year to the next. It just should exist because it's the one time people who have no other resources and who suffer all of the systemic exclusions that we're struggling with now have the opportunity to come into the legal system and their voices are put first. It's just great.
well, Sarah, I want to thank you so much for your time. We're coming to the conclusion of the show, and I've so enjoyed learning more about you and your background. And as someone who studied Spanish literature and political science in undergrad, I truly appreciate how it opens a lot of doors and opens your thinking to many, many things. So I thank you for the work you're doing as executive director of the Nashville Conflict Resolution Center. People can learn more about it at nashvilleconflict.org. Do I have that right?
You do?
Perfect. So before I let you go, I always like to ask guests if they would leave our audience with some words of wisdom to help us get through this challenging time.
Um, be curious and be nice. It really is that both banal and profound. Just
Excellent. Well, if you
be
would like to
curious
elaborate
and
on
be
that,
kind.
be curious and be kind. That was simple, but to the point, very powerful. Well, Sara, may you stay well and healthy. And again, I'm so grateful for you coming on the show today.
Thank you. It's great to talk to you.